The gate agent's hand was already trembling before she even looked up at him. Nobody on that concourse knew it yet. But in less than 15 minutes, a Boeing 777 sitting at Gate C42 in Charlotte would be pulled from its departure slot, surrounded by federal officials, and the airline that owned it would spend the next 6 months trying to recover from what was about to happen at that door. He didn't know it either. All Marcus Whitfield knew, standing there in his charcoal suit with his boarding pass in one hand and his coffee in the other, was that he had a meeting in Chicago in 5 hours that could define the next decade of his company. He had no idea that in a few short minutes, he would become the reason a flight never left the ground. Marcus was 44 years old, and he had built Halcyon Avionics from a 2-person garage operation into one of the fastest-growing aerospace technology firms on the East Coast. His company designed navigation systems that half the regional airlines in the country now depended on. He had shaken hands with senators. He had been on the cover of a trade magazine. And yet, standing at that gate, none of that mattered, because to the woman scanning his ticket, he was simply a black man in a first-class line who, in her mind, didn't quite fit the picture. It hadn't always been this way, or rather, it had. But there had been a time in his life when he didn't yet have the vocabulary to name what kept happening to him. Growing up outside Richmond, Virginia, he'd watched his mother, a nurse, get stopped by security in stores she'd shopped in for 20 years while white customers walked past unbothered. He'd watched his older brother get pulled over 3 times in a single month, driving the exact same route to community college, for reasons that were never quite explained and never resulted in a single citation. By the time Marcus was in his 20s, building his first failed startup out of a rented office above a laundromat, he'd developed a kind of internal radar for the moment, the specific half-second when someone's assumptions about him shifted the ground beneath a conversation. He hated that he had that radar. He hated more that it had never once, in 20 years, been wrong. That morning had started exactly the way Marcus liked his mornings to start, early, quiet, and under control. He'd been up before 5, reviewing his slide deck one final time in the hotel room, because today wasn't just any trip. Today he was flying to Chicago to close a partnership deal with one of the largest commercial carriers in the country, a deal that had taken 18 months of negotiation, dozens of phone calls, and more sleepless nights than he cared to count. If it went through, Halcyon Avionics would triple in size within 2 years. He'd booked his first-class seat 6 weeks in advance, specifically so he could use the 3-hour flight to rehearse his pitch one final time, undisturbed, headphones in, laptop open. Every second of that trip had been planned down to the minute. He left nothing to chance. Not the deal, not the flight, not even the coffee he grabbed on his way to the gate. Security had been smooth. TSA pre-check, shoes on the whole time, bag through in under a minute. He'd checked his phone twice, replied to an email from his COO, and made his way toward Gate C42 with the calm, practiced rhythm of a man who had flown this route 100 times before. Boarding began the way it always does. The agent's voice crackled over the intercom, first calling families with small children, then premium members, then first class. Marcus stepped into the line, boarding pass ready on his phone, passport tucked into his jacket pocket, just in case. Ahead of him, a silver-haired man in a rumpled blazer scanned through, without so much as a glance from the gate agent. Behind him, a young woman in yoga pants and a first-class boarding pass breezed past with a polite nod. He thought about his father in that moment, though he couldn't have said why. His father had driven a delivery truck for 31 years, had never once made it past coach class in his entire life, and had told Marcus, back when Marcus was 17 and furious about being followed around a department store by a security guard, that the world would sometimes make him prove things twice that other people never had to prove once. "Don't let it make you bitter," his father had said. Let it make you exact. Marcus had carried that sentence with him through business school, through 4 failed startups, before Halcyon finally caught fire, through boardrooms where he was so often the only black face at the table that he'd learned to notice, immediately, the specific texture of being underestimated. He thought he'd made his peace with it. Standing in that boarding line, he realized peace was never really finished. It just got quieter. Then it was his turn. He held up his phone. The agent, a woman named Denise Carver, mid-30s, sharp ponytail, lanyard, heavy with badges, took one look at the screen, then one look at him, and something in her face changed. It was subtle. It was the kind of shift most people in that line wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus noticed. He had felt that particular flicker before, more times in his life than he could count. The look that arrives a half-second before judgment. The look that says you don't belong here before a single word is spoken. "Can I see that again?" Denise asked, her voice pleasant enough on the surface, but tight underneath. Marcus held the phone steady. The barcode scanned. Green checkmark. Seat 2A, first class. Name matched his government ID exactly. "I'm going to need you to step to the side for a moment," she said. Marcus blinked. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" "Just a routine verification," Denise said, already waving the next passenger, a heavy-set man in a Patriots hoodie, through without a second glance. Marcus stepped aside. He watched as passenger after passenger streamed past him into the jet bridge, each one holding an identical first-class boarding pass. Each one waved through in under 3 seconds. Nobody else got a routine verification. Nobody else got a second look. He stood there, coffee in hand, boarding pass glowing uselessly on his phone screen, while a line of people who had paid the exact same fare walked past him like he was invisible. Or worse, like he was a problem to be managed. He said nothing. Not yet. Years of sitting across boardroom tables from people who underestimated him had taught him one hard lesson. The moment you raise your voice, you become the story. And he refused, absolutely refused, to become anyone's story that morning. A second agent joined Denise. His name tag read Gary Holt, supervisor. Gary took Marcus's boarding pass, studied it for an uncomfortably long 10 seconds, then looked back toward the gate podium and murmured something to Denise that Marcus couldn't hear. Whatever it wasn't reassuring, because Gary's next move was to pick up the gate phone. "Sir, we're just going to need a few more minutes," Gary said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "A few more minutes for what, exactly?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level almost gentle. "My ticket scanned. My ID matches." "What's the issue?" "We just want to make sure everything's in order," Gary said. Everything was already in order. That was the maddening part. Everything had been in order from the very beginning. And yet, here he was, standing off to the side of the jet bridge like a suspect being processed, while the line behind him thinned out and the last few coach passengers shuffled past, sneaking curious glances his way. By now, other travelers had noticed. A mother traveling with 2 kids paused mid-step to glance back. An older man in a Carolina Panthers cap frowned and muttered something to his wife. A college-aged girl with earbuds in slowed her pace just enough to watch. Whispers began to ripple through the gate area, the particular kind of low, uneasy murmur that spreads when people sense something is wrong, but don't yet know what. A businessman near the front of the coach line, phone pressed to his ear mid-call, actually paused his conversation soon to watch, his voice trailing off into silence as his eyes tracked Marcus standing off to the side. "Hang on," he murmured into the phone. "Something's going on here." He didn't hang up, he didn't put the phone away. He simply stood there, watching, the way people watch a car accident they can't quite look away from. Present, aware, and doing absolutely nothing. That, Marcus would think later, was the part that stayed with him longest. Not the accusation itself, but the audience it gathered. Dozens of people who sensed, on some level, that what they were witnessing didn't sit right, and who nonetheless did nothing but watch. Nobody stepped forward yet. Nobody asked the gate agents a single question. The unspoken agreement among strangers in an airport, it seemed, was that discomfort was easier to carry silently than to interrupt out loud. Did he do something? I heard his ticket wasn't real. Maybe it's a security thing. None of it was true. None of it was based on anything except the sight of a black man standing off to the side while a line of mostly white passengers walked past him onto the plane. But that didn't stop the whispers from hardening into something that felt, to the people around him, like fact. Marcus stood perfectly still. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and quietly began recording, not the confrontation itself, not yet, but the timeline, the timestamp, the gate number, every word exchanged. He had learned long ago that composure, documented clearly, was worth more than 1,000 raised voices. 10 minutes passed. Then 12. Behind the podium, Gary was now on a call with someone. His voice hushed, his eyes flicking toward Marcus every few seconds, like he was afraid Marcus might do something, as if standing quietly with a valid boarding pass was itself a threat. Finally, Gary hung up the phone and turned to Marcus with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to something closer to discomfort. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while we finish confirming your reservation," he said. "We can't board you until this is resolved." That sentence, "we can't board you," landed in the gate area like a dropped glass. It was loud enough, clear enough, that the dozen or so remaining passengers still lingering near the podium all turned to look. A businesswoman in a navy pantsuit stopped scrolling her phone. A father holding a sleeping toddler frowned deeply. The whispers grew bolder, no longer whispers at all. Did they just deny him boarding? I don't understand. He had a first-class ticket, didn't he? This is insane. Marcus felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck, not from embarrassment, but from something colder. The recognition that this was no longer a misunderstanding being quietly sorted out behind a podium. This was a public spectacle, unfolding in real time, in front of dozens of strangers, all because two gate agents had decided, without a shred of evidence, that something about him didn't add up. Still, he did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked, calmly, clearly, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "Can you tell me, specifically, what part of my reservation is in question? My name matches my ID. My seat is confirmed. I'd like to understand exactly what the problem is." Gary didn't have an answer. That silence, the visible, squirming absence of any actual explanation, did more damage to the airline in that moment than any accusation could have. Marcus stepped back, phone still recording, and made one call. It lasted less than 90 seconds. His voice was calm, almost conversational, though anyone standing close enough would have heard the steel underneath it. "Hi, it's Marcus Whitfield," he said. "I'm at Gate C42 in Charlotte, and I've just been denied boarding on a confirmed first-class reservation with no explanation. I need you to pull the reservation and the gate logs immediately. And I need someone from corporate on site in the next 10 minutes. He didn't shout the name of who he was calling. He didn't need to, because within 4 minutes, the entire energy at Gate C42 shifted. A woman in a sharp gray blazer, moving with the brisk urgency of someone whose entire day had just been upended, arrived first. Her badge read Operations Manager. Behind her came 2 more airline employees. Then, astonishingly, a man in a suit who introduced himself only as being from corporate compliance. Word had clearly traveled fast, and not through casual gossip, through channels that made airline employees suddenly very, very careful about what they said next. "Mr. Whitfield," the operations manager said, her voice tight with the particular strain of someone who already suspected how badly this was about to go. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Marcus did, calmly, precisely, time-stamped, because he had it all on video. The scan, the green check mark. The other passengers waved through. The vague routine verification that somehow only applied to him. The operations manager turned to Gary and Denise. "Pull the reservation," she said. It took 90 seconds. 90 seconds to reveal what should have been obvious from the very beginning. Marcus Whitfield's ticket had never been in question. His identification had matched perfectly. His seat assignment had never changed. There was no security flag, no fraud alert, no booking discrepancy of any kind. There had never been a single legitimate reason to stop him. The only thing that had actually happened, laid bare now in front of a growing crowd of stone-faced airline officials, was that two employees had looked at a black man holding a first-class boarding pass and decided on nothing more than instinct and assumption that he didn't belong there. "There's no discrepancy," the operations manager said quietly, almost to herself, staring at the screen like she wished it would show her something different. "Then why?" Marcus said, and for the first time his voice carried an edge, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably firm. "Was I the only passenger in that entire line who got stopped?" Nobody answered, because there was no answer that wouldn't indict the very people standing at that podium. It was in that silence that something else happened. Something small, almost easy to miss, but Marcus would remember it long after the terminations, long after the headlines. A young flight attendant, no older than 25, who had been standing near the jet bridge door the entire time, quietly rewinding through the last 20 minutes in her own memory, stepped forward. "I need to say something," she said, and her voice shook slightly. The particular shake of someone who had never in her professional life contradicted a supervisor in public and was about to do exactly that. "I was standing right there when this started." I watched Denise scan his pass myself. It came up green, same as everyone else's. I remember thinking, in the moment, that I didn't understand why he was being stopped, and I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. She looked directly at the operations manager now, her composure returning even as her voice stayed low. "It should have been my place. I'm sorry it took this long for me to say it out loud." The operations manager wrote something down, her pen moving fast now, no longer the neutral note-taking of someone gathering facts, but the urgent scrawl of someone realizing the scope of what had happened was far larger and far more indefensible than she'd initially understood. Because now it wasn't only Marcus's account, it wasn't only two outside witnesses. It was one of the airline's own employees, on the record, confirming that the entire staff at that gate had watched a valid boarding pass get treated as suspicious for no discernible reason, and had said nothing until this moment, when saying nothing had finally become unbearable. Gary Holt's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. He opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again, visibly understanding that any word out of him now would only make things worse. Denise had stopped looking at the floor and was now staring, almost pleadingly, at the young flight attendant, as though hoping she might soften what she'd just said. She didn't. She simply held her ground, arms folded, chin level, the discomfort of the moment plainly written across her face, but her resolve intact. Inside the aircraft, passengers had grown restless. The scheduled departure time had come and gone. Flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances at the front of the cabin. A man in seat 14C leaned into the aisle and asked a flight attendant what was going on. She offered only a tight, practiced smile and said they were resolving a boarding matter, which satisfied absolutely no one. Outside on the jet bridge, the situation had escalated well beyond two nervous gate agents. An airport duty manager arrived. Then someone from the airline's regional headquarters, patched in by phone, speaking loudly enough that Marcus and several bystanders could hear fragments of the call. Words like incident report and potential discrimination claim and legal exposure drifted through the air, and with each phrase, Gary Holt's face grew paler, Denise Carver had gone very quiet. She stood slightly behind Gary now, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. The confident authority she'd carried just 15 minutes earlier completely drained away. It was remarkable, Marcus thought, how quickly certainty could evaporate once it was actually forced to answer for itself. It was the young flight attendant's confession, the crack in the airline's own ranks, that finally seemed to break the paralysis holding the rest of the crowd in place. If one of their own employees could admit, out loud, in front of a supervisor, that this had been wrong from the start, then the passengers who had been quietly uneasy for the last 20 minutes no longer had an excuse to stay silent either. 3 passengers who had been waiting nearby stepped forward on their own, unprompted. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and a cardigan spoke first. "I saw the whole thing," she said to the operations manager. "That man's ticket scanned the exact same as mine. Green light, no problem. They waved me right through. Then they stopped him and made him stand there for, 15 minutes? 20? While everybody else walked past him. It wasn't right, and I think you all know it wasn't right." A second passenger, a man in his 30s with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder, nodded along. "I filmed some of it too, for what it's worth. Wasn't trying to cause trouble, just, it felt like something I should have on record." A third voice joined them, sharper, angrier than the others. The businessman who had paused his phone call earlier, now fully present, phone lowered, jaw tight. "I'll be honest, I almost didn't say anything. And that's bothering me more than what happened to him," he said, nodding toward Marcus. "I watched a man do everything right. Perfect ticket, perfect ID, calm the entire time, and get treated like a criminal, while the rest of us walked past like nothing was happening. If nobody else is going to say it, I will. That was wrong, and everybody standing here watching it knew it was wrong the whole time." The operations manager, pen frozen mid-sentence on her incident report, looked up at the small crowd that had now formed a loose half-circle around the podium. 3 passengers, 1 flight attendant, and dozens more watching from a distance, phones out, some recording, some simply unable to look away. What had started as a quiet, containable mistake at a single gate had, in the span of 20 minutes, become something the airline could no longer manage quietly. No matter how many supervisors or compliance officers they sent to the scene, the operations manager's jaw tightened. She turned to Gary. "You denied a passenger boarding in full view of the gate, with no documented reason, and multiple witnesses recorded it." We thought," Gary started, and then stopped, because there was no sentence that finished that thought without sounding exactly as bad as it was. "You thought what?" Marcus asked quietly. Not shouting, not gloating, just asking the way you'd ask a question you already knew the answer to, but needed spoken aloud anyway. "You thought I didn't look like I belonged in seat 2A? The silence that followed was its own kind of confession. But it didn't end there. Because just as the operations manager turned to draft the first line of an incident report, Gary Holt, perhaps sensing that silence was about to become an admission of guilt, perhaps simply panicking, made the situation immeasurably worse. "With respect," he said, straightening his shoulders, like a man trying to reclaim ground he'd already lost, "we have protocols for a reason. We can't just wave people through, because they're upset about being asked questions." The words landed wrong, and everyone standing at that podium seemed to feel it land wrong at the exact same moment. The silver-haired woman in the cardigan actually let out an audible scoff. The operations manager's head snapped toward Gary, with an expression that was less confusion now, and more something close to disbelief. "Nobody's upset about being asked questions," Marcus said, his voice still even, still controlled, though something underneath it had sharpened. "I'm upset that I was the only person asked questions. Out of 140 passengers, you scanned my pass, saw a green light, identical to everyone else's green light, and decided that mine needed a second opinion. I'd like you to explain the protocol that produces that outcome for exactly one passenger on this flight." Gary opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked, for the first time since the confrontation began, genuinely frightened, not of Marcus, but of the widening realization that there was no protocol, that there had never been a protocol, that the only variable that had changed between passenger after passenger walking through cleanly and Marcus being pulled aside was the color of his skin standing behind a first-class boarding pass. The corporate compliance officer, a quiet man who had said almost nothing since arriving, finally spoke, his tone clipped and formal in the way of someone already drafting a legal memo in his head. "Mr. Holt, I'm going to need you to stop talking." Gary stopped talking. It was Denise who broke next, and it wasn't dramatic. No tears, no outburst. She simply uncrossed her arms, looked at the floor, and said, quietly enough that only the people closest to the podium could hear it, "I don't have a good reason. I saw him and I thought." She stopped herself. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone standing there understood exactly what she'd been about to say, and the fact that she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud was, in its own way, worse than if she had. The operations manager closed her eyes for a long moment, the particular posture of someone doing very fast, very unpleasant math about liability, press exposure, and the video that was almost certainly already circulating on someone's phone. When she opened them again, her voice had changed. No longer defensive, no longer careful, but resigned to the size of what was actually happening. "I need both of you to step away from the podium," she said to Gary and Denise. "Now." The announcement came over the gate speakers a few minutes later, and it landed on the waiting cabin like a splash of cold water. Due to an operational review, the flight would be delayed indefinitely, and passengers should remain seated for further updates. A collective groan rippled through the aircraft. Business travelers checked watches and recalculated connections. A woman near the back sighed loudly and said, "To no one in particular, this is exactly why I hate flying out of this airport." None of them yet understood that the operational review they were grumbling about was the direct result of two employees deciding, without a single piece of evidence, that a black CEO in first class must be a mistake. Marcus was escorted, not detained, escorted, a distinction the airline's representatives were now extremely careful to emphasize, to a private office just off the gate area. There, over the next 40 minutes, he calmly, methodically laid out everything: the time-stamped video, the sequence of events, the fact that not a single other first-class passenger had been asked for so much as a second glance at their boarding pass. The room itself felt like a small pressure chamber, a single table, 4 chairs, a window overlooking the tarmac where his aircraft still sat, unmoving, its jet bridge disconnected, ground crew milling about beneath it with the particular restlessness of people waiting on instructions nobody had given them yet. Every few minutes, someone new entered. A claims specialist, a second lawyer, at one point a woman who introduced herself only as being from corporate communications, whose first question wasn't about what had happened to Marcus at all, but about whether he intended to post the video publicly. "That's an interesting first question," Marcus said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "You might want to lead with something else next time." The woman flushed and didn't ask again. What struck Marcus most, sitting in that small room while the machinery of institutional damage control assembled itself around him, was how quickly the airline's posture had shifted from suspicion to something that looked, uncomfortably, like fear. Not fear of him, exactly, but fear of what he represented now. A documented, witnessed, indefensible failure that no amount of practiced language could soften. He'd spent enough years in boardrooms to recognize the specific choreography of an organization trying to contain a crisis, rather than actually reckon with it. And for the first hour, that was exactly what he watched happening in front of him. Careful phrasing, cautious apologies, nobody quite willing to say the word that mattered. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus finally said, halfway through the 40th minute, setting his phone down on the table between them. "I'm not interested in a settlement conversation right now. I'm not interested in a voucher, or a bump to a future flight, or language crafted by a legal team to minimize exposure. I want to know that the two people at that podium are going to face a real consequence, and I want to know what changes. So the next passenger who looks like me doesn't have to make a phone call to get treated like a human being." It was that sentence, quiet, unhurried, entirely without theatrics, that seemed to finally cut through the careful choreography in the room. The corporate communications woman stopped taking notes for a moment. The claims specialist glanced sideways at her colleague. And it was in the silence that followed that Robert Ashcroft, the regional director, walked in. Robert Ashcroft, the regional director, had driven directly from a meeting across town the moment he heard what was unfolding. Ashcroft was not a man used to apologizing. His entire career had been built on projecting calm authority, and yet, sitting across from Marcus Whitfield in that small office, he looked like a man who understood, with total clarity, exactly how much this was about to cost his airline. "Mr. Whitfield," Ashcroft said, "I want to personally apologize for what happened out there. There is no version of this where what you experienced was acceptable." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, "but I'm less interested in an apology to me than I am in what happens to make sure this doesn't happen to the next person who doesn't have a phone in his pocket recording everything, or the resources to make a phone call that gets a regional director here in 30 minutes. Ashcroft nodded slowly. "We're pulling the full incident report. Both employees are being placed on immediate leave pending investigation." "That's a start," Marcus said. "But leave isn't accountability. Leave is a pause button." Ashcroft leaned back in his chair, and for a moment he looked less like a regional director and more like a man doing the math on his own career. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Off the record." "You can ask. What would you have done if that call you made hadn't gotten someone here in 4 minutes? If you'd just been a passenger, no company, no name anyone recognized, what happens to you then?" Marcus let the question sit for a moment before answering, because it was, he knew, the actual question underneath everything that had happened that morning. "I get put on a later flight," he said finally. "Maybe I get a $50 voucher and an apology nobody means. Maybe there's no video. Because maybe I don't have the presence of mind to start recording. Because maybe I'm someone who's never had to develop that instinct. And maybe the story ends exactly where your employees wanted it to end. Quietly. Forgotten by Thursday, with nothing learned and nobody accountable. That's the version of this that happens 99 times out of 100, Mr. Ashcroft. I got lucky enough, today, to be the 100th. Ashcroft didn't have a response to that. He didn't try to manufacture one. He simply nodded, slowly, and made a note on the legal pad in front of him. A note Marcus would later learn became the opening line of the airline's internal investigation report. Verbatim. He was right, and Ashcroft knew it. Over the following days, as the internal investigation unfolded and the video, inevitably, inescapably, made its way online, the full weight of what had happened at Gate C42 became impossible for the airline to minimize or explain away. The footage was unambiguous. Passenger after passenger scanning through in seconds, and then Marcus stopped, questioned, and set aside while the line moved around him like water around a stone. The airline's public statement, released 2 days later, admitted fault without qualification. Denise Carver and Gary Holt were both terminated following the investigation. Not simply reassigned, not quietly transferred to a different terminal, but formally let go. After the internal review concluded that no legitimate justification existed for singling out Marcus's boarding pass over any other passengers. It was, the report noted bluntly, a decision rooted entirely in assumption rather than protocol. For Gary, the fallout extended well beyond the termination itself. The video, once it surfaced publicly, spread faster than the airline's communications team could get ahead of it. Clipped, captioned, and shared across every major platform within 48 hours, viewed by millions, dissected frame by strangers who had never met him and never would. His name leaked within the week, first in comment sections, then in local news coverage. Reporters called his house. A producer from a national morning show left 3 messages on his voicemail requesting an interview he never agreed to give. In the weeks that followed, he found himself unable to find comparable work anywhere in the industry. Word had spread through regional aviation circles faster than any reference check could catch up to, and more than one interview ended abruptly, the moment a hiring manager recognized his name from the coverage. His marriage, already strained before the incident, buckled further under the weight of the attention. His wife later told a mutual friend that the hardest part wasn't the anger from strangers online. It was watching her husband replay the same 20 seconds of footage, alone, late at night, trying to understand a version of himself he didn't recognize. He would later tell a local reporter, in a rare and uncomfortable interview he finally agreed to, 6 months later, that he hadn't thought of himself as someone capable of that kind of snap judgment. Until the video forced him to watch himself do exactly that, over and over, from every possible angle, in slow motion, dissected by strangers who understood in 3 seconds. What had taken him a public firing and a ruined career to understand about himself. It was, he admitted, the hardest thing he'd ever had to sit with, and he wasn't sure, even a year later, that he'd fully finished sitting with it. Denise's path was quieter, but no less painful. She stayed largely out of the public eye, but colleagues who knew her described a woman genuinely shaken by what she'd done, not performatively, not for show, but in the way of someone forced to confront a version of herself she hadn't known was there. She wrote Marcus a letter, unprompted, weeks after the incident. He never made its contents public, but those close to him said he read it twice, sat with it for a long while, and then quietly forgave her. Not because the harm hadn't been real, but because he believed, as he'd said many times since, that growth was only possible for people willing to actually look at what they'd done. The airline didn't stop at 2 terminations. Under mounting public pressure and, Marcus suspected, genuine institutional shame, the company overhauled its gateboarding protocols nationwide. Every employee involved in boarding operations was required to complete an expanded training program on implicit bias, with real incident case studies, Marcus's included, used as part of the curriculum. A new verification standard was introduced requiring documented, specific justification any time a confirmed boarding pass triggered additional scrutiny, no more routine verification as an unaccountable catch-all. The airline's board issued a public commitment to an annual third-party audit of boarding-related complaints, broken down by demographic data, with results published openly. The financial cost was severe and public, and impossible for the airline's leadership to spin away. Within a week of the video surfacing, the company's stock dipped sharply enough that analysts openly cited the incident by name on earnings calls. 2 major corporate accounts, clients who booked thousands of employee seats a year, quietly paused their travel contracts pending review. A national civil rights organization opened a formal inquiry, and though Marcus himself never filed a lawsuit, choosing instead to pursue the broader policy fight rather than a personal payout, the airline's legal department spent the better part of a year fielding related complaints from other passengers who, emboldened by the visibility of what had happened at Gate C42, came forward with strikingly similar stories of their own. Stories that had, until then, gone nowhere, dismissed as isolated incidents rather than recognized as a pattern. There was a coda to the story that never made it into any press release. Though Marcus told it once, years later, to a small room of graduate students at a leadership seminar he'd been invited to speak at. 6 weeks after the incident, he was walking through a different airport, Atlanta, this time on a trip that had nothing to do with Halcyon or Chicago or any of it, when he saw a young black woman standing off to the side of a boarding line, phone in hand, being asked by a gate agent to wait just a moment while everyone around her boarded freely. He recognized the shape of it instantly. The stiffness in her shoulders, the careful, controlled patience in her face that he knew, from the inside, was doing enormous work to hold something much angrier in check. He didn't make a scene. He didn't announce who he was. He simply walked over, stood beside her, and asked quietly if everything was all right. They said, "There's an issue with my ticket," she said. "There's no issue with my ticket." Marcus didn't say anything about Charlotte. He didn't need to. He simply stayed there, a visible presence beside her, until the gate agent, suddenly aware that 2 people were now waiting, watching, documenting, found, with startling speed, that there had in fact been no issue with her ticket after all. Sometimes, Marcus told the graduate students, the whole job isn't fixing the system. Sometimes the job is just being the person who doesn't walk past. It would be easy and satisfying to end the story there, with terminations, with policy change, with a villain punished and a hero vindicated. But Marcus never wanted the story to end at punishment. Punishment, he said later, in the one interview he agreed to give about the whole ordeal, was necessary, but it wasn't the point. The point, he told the reporter, sitting in his office in front of a wall of aviation patents his company had filed over the years, isn't that 2 people lost their jobs. People losing jobs doesn't fix a culture. What fixes a culture is everyone else in that airport that day, asking themselves why they didn't say anything while it was happening. The passengers who saw it and looked away. The ones who assumed there must be a reason. That's where the real work is, not in punishing the 2 people at the podium, but in the 100 people who watched and stayed silent and have to decide next time whether they'll do the same. He used the incident, eventually, as the foundation for something larger. A foundation, funded initially out of his own pocket, aimed at training airline and airport staff nationwide on recognizing and interrupting unconscious bias before it turned into exactly the kind of public humiliation he'd endured at Gate C42. Within a year, 3 additional airlines had signed on to pilot the training program. Marcus insisted, every time, that the program not be named after him. "This was never about me," he said. "This was about the passenger after me, and the one after that." As for the flight itself, the one that sat motionless at Gate C42 for nearly 2 hours that morning while investigators, supervisors, and corporate officials scrambled to understand what had happened. It eventually departed, more than 90 minutes late, carrying a cabin full of passengers who had, whether they realized it or not, just witnessed something far more consequential than a routine delay. Marcus was offered his original seat back, 2A, with a formal apology delivered personally by Robert Ashcroft in front of the very same gate agents who had denied him boarding less than 2 hours earlier. He took the seat. He did not gloat. He simply opened his laptop, put in his headphones, and returned to rehearsing the pitch he'd planned to rehearse all along. The meeting in Chicago that, 3 weeks later, would close as the largest partnership deal in his company's history. But it was something the silver-haired woman from the gate said, weeks later. In a message she sent to Marcus after tracking down his office through his company's website. That seemed to capture what so many people who witnessed that morning walked away carrying with them. "I've thought about it every day since," she wrote. "Not about you. You handled it better than anyone had a right to expect. I've thought about myself, about how I stood there and watched it happen, and told myself it wasn't my business to say anything. I keep asking myself what kind of person I want to be the next time. I don't want to be the person who just watches. That, in the end, was the real reckoning, not the terminations, not the headlines, not even the policy changes that rippled out across an entire industry. It was the quiet, uncomfortable moment repeated in the minds of dozens of strangers who happened to be standing at Gate C42 that morning, when they were forced to ask themselves the question Marcus Whitfield never had to ask out loud. If you see it happening, and you say nothing, what does that make you? Prejudice, as it turned out, rarely announced itself with a slur or a shout. More often, it showed up exactly the way it had that morning in Charlotte, in a lingering glance, in a routine verification that only applied to one passenger, in a hesitation nobody could quite explain but everybody could feel. Showed up in silence both. The silence of the people enforcing it, and the silence of the people watching it happen. There's a version of this story that ends with satisfaction. Two people lose their jobs. The CEO gets his apology, the airline pays its price, and the audience closes the tab feeling like justice, tidy and complete, has been served. But the people who were actually standing at Gate C42 that morning will tell you it never felt tidy. It felt uncomfortable in a way that lingered. It made people question moments in their own past. A time they'd assumed the best about one stranger and the worst about another. A time they'd stood quietly at the edge of something unfair and told themselves it wasn't theirs to fix. That discomfort, more than any headline or termination, might be the only part of the story actually worth carrying forward. Because the truth is, most of us will never be a CEO with a phone call that summons a regional director in 4 minutes. Most of us will be the silver-haired woman in the cardigan, or the businessman who almost kept walking, or the flight attendant standing near the door who has to decide, in real time, whether staying quiet is easier than telling the truth. The next Gate C42 won't announce itself. It will look at first like a routine delay, an ordinary morning, a decision that seems small enough to ignore. And the only real question, the one Marcus Whitfield's story leaves behind, long after the deal closed and the headlines faded, is what any of us will choose to do the next time we're standing close enough to watch it happen. Marcus Whitfield closed his 18-month deal 3 weeks after that flight, exactly as planned. Halcyon Avionics went on to double its workforce within 2 years. But if you ask him today what he remembers most about that period of his life, he won't talk about the deal at all. He'll talk about 12 minutes standing at a jet bridge, holding a boarding pass that had never once been wrong, waiting for the world around him to catch up to a truth that should have been obvious from the very first scan of a screen. And he'll tell you, if you ask, that the flight didn't really get delayed that morning because of him. It got delayed because, for 12 long minutes, an entire airport had to stop and confront the gap between what it claimed to believe about fairness and what it had actually just done, in full view of everyone at Gate C42, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other and ended like nothing anyone there would ever forget.